Okay, so we are now on chapter 2, how newsrooms work, and we'll take you inside the Oregonian newsroom, or at least the textbook will. I'll talk a little bit more broadly about it. So what is news? Editors and reporters and readers ask, what is news? How do you define news? Well, we have to use our news judgment, and that's our ability to determine which stories are most important and interesting to readers. What is going to capture their attention, what is not. And again, we talked about in the last PowerPoint how this can be influenced by readers and consumers of news, and they can affect how the media decides to let stories in or let stories out. So there can be a bit of back and forth with that. Editors are often called gatekeepers, and they decide where the story runs in the publications. Is it going to be on the front page, other places? And what, again, here's an example of what is news. This is back from a while ago when the president was President Bush. President visits, it's a big deal, but it may not be on the front page. It may come inside the paper. Oceana is responsible for 12,000 local jobs, all right? So that's going to be pretty high up in the paper because that has a lot of impact, and we're going to talk about different news values soon. The vice president's chief of staff is indicted. That's a huge story, right? And so that's going to be in there. It's national, even though it's this Virginia paper, it's national news of a lot of importance, and Virginia happens to be near DC. A tragedy involving a police officer will lead, and they'll have promos to other types of stories that are not important enough to be written about on the front page, but eye-catching enough to draw people into the publication. Okay, what makes a story interesting? Impact. Does it affect a lot of people? Immediacy. Did it just happen, right? There's a news cycle. It has to happen pretty quickly and be of recent importance, or then it's an old story, right? History. Proximity. Did it happen nearby? Is it in Chicago? Is it in the suburbs? In Illinois, at least, right? When it starts getting further and further away, we have to convince our editors that it's a relevant story. Prominence. And prominence is about somebody rather. So if whoever the mayor is at the time, in this case, it's Mayor Rahm Emanuel. If he says something or he gets arrested, right, then it's big news. So if it happens to a prominent official, then it's news, and that's called prominence. Novelty is, if you've ever heard the expression, man bites dog, like dog bites man is the usual story, dogs are always biting people. But if the person turns around and bites the dog, then that's new. That's got a new angle, and that's novel. So that's called novelty, right? Conflict. Much of what journalism is about is conflict. We need that tension for a narrative. That's what draws people in. That's what they care about. Take my solutions journalism course. We'll address conflict, but we'll also address the solution, which I think is turning things on its head. Just a little plug there. Emotions. Newspaper stories also have to have emotions in them. 5 things every reporter needs to remember about readers. They are in a hurry. They have short attention spans. They want stories that connect, feel personal to them. They want stories told in a compelling way. And there's more than just one type of reader. There's people who skim. There's people who go through every sentence very carefully. You want to be able to write for a variety of them. How a story gets written, you spend a lot of time chasing it, and then some of the time writing it. 10% of the time writing it. In that Jenny Deadline example, please go through that comic. First of all, it's a comic. And then second of all, it's a really good walkthrough of what it is like to cover a story. And that character, spends a lot of time reporting on it. And then not everything she has is appropriate to go into the story. So not everything you hear makes it into a finished story. Not everything is as it seems. Clear lines of authority and avoid chaos. So they have it. Most papers writers are either general assignment, they cover a wide range of stories, or beat reporters, and they cover a specific topic. Some newsrooms have now teamwork, right? And that's a big part, especially as we work into more multimedia. Longer pieces, investigative pieces usually take teams. But who's who in the newsroom? And this is where your textbook will talk more about the Oregonian, and I suggest you look at those examples. I'm going to have to go through it fairly quickly here. We've got a publisher, right? Sam Zell was a publisher of the Chicago Tribune. You'll hear from him some bad words in page 1, the movie. But that's the ultimate boss and presides over all departments to ensure profitability, and that's key when you watch the video of him. bottom line. He cared about the bottom line. Production manager oversees staff and equipment. Circulation manager oversees distribution of the newspaper, advertising, would coordinate sales and production of classified and display ads. You've also got the editor, right, on the what we call the editorial side. Editor who runs the newsroom has a final say in the story selection and news philosophy. A managing editor, that person tends to be the day-to-day person. A photo editor who's obviously editing the photos, choosing the images, going through that, managing the photographers, and often the graphic artists as well. You'll have an online editor, and this is starting to shift a little bit as everything becomes more online and we're starting to think more online. But the online editor would work with other editors and reporters to develop material for the website. Manages a team of reporters and editors. And you've got the copy desk chief who oversees the editing. So AP style, we won't focus on too much in this class, but that's where somebody would look for Associated Press style. Is it consistent with the style that many newspapers use? And then also layout they tend to focus on the copy desk. A features editor, again, assigns and edits feature stories, manages feature writers and reviewers. Sports editor, the same for all the sports stories and sports reporters. City editor is the one who assigns and edits most local and hard news stories. Manages and reports and manages a news reporter. A daily is printed every day. A weekly, once a week, you got it. A newsletter is generally printed once a month, although magazines too, but those are even a different entity than newspapers. A mainstream newspaper will be the New York Times, Alternative Press, the Village Voice in New York, the Chicago Reader would be our local example, and specialty publication, Fur and Feather Magazine, right? So very niche audience for that. Broadsheet is the large format page, and a tabloid is half the size of a broadsheet. So in Chicago, you want to think of the Tribune is your origami one that you're opening and, have to have a lot of room for it. Tabloid is the Sun-Times, and now the Independent, the school paper, is a broadsheet where you can just open it like that, right, and read it on the L without bothering your neighbor too much. So that's a difference. Sometimes tabloid we think of as like, oh, it's the National Enquirer, it's a sensationalistic, but the literal definition is just this form that you can open it, that it's half the size of a broadsheet. The National Enquirer happens to be in tabloid format, so we start to think of those tabloids as those tabloids are synonymous with sensationalism, but it's not. Stories can be spiked or killed. That means getting rid of. Writers can create a thumbsucker or a goat choker that are boring. Editors can trim or cut, so just neatly trim, maybe take out a few paragraphs, or butcher, which means there's a lot of blood, right? So it means you're cutting up the story, or bury stories where you put them inside the paper and not as important. Parts of the story, we've got the headline, right? Big, bold at the top, doesn't have all the little words in it, but tells you what happened. Byline, who wrote it. The dateline actually doesn't talk about the date, but it's where it's from, in this case, Portland, Oregon. But because we know it's Portland, Oregon, we don't have the Oregon in there. Lead is the first couple sentences, the first paragraph. Quote is what is in between quote marks by a source, verbatim. Attribution is who said it. She said, he said, the name. Photo, and then at the bottom of the photo you have a photo credit, who took pictures, who took the photo. A lift out quote, sometimes called a pull out quote, is something interesting that was said during the story by one of the people that you're quoting. That pig honked off a lot of commuters. Okay, I didn't say it was always good, but that, something you want to pull out to catch people's attention. Tagline is usually where they'll mention what the reporter does and what their position is and give you a email address where you can contact them. Parts of a page, there's the flag, a name of a paper set in a special type. It never changes. There's the edition. Daily papers often have print street sales and home delivery editions, sometimes a morning and afternoon, although that's fallen off a lot. There's an infographic with informational graphics, display key facts. You'll have the deck, right? And a subhead, which is a subline headline written by copy editors to give you a little bit more about the story. Parts of the page, we've also got a text that's measured in inches. Get me 15 inches of text. A jump line that tells people where the story continues to, or as we say, jumps. So at the bottom, it'll say to page 6, story jumps to page 6. One of the ideas now is to do less of those jumps because people don't actually follow along with many jumps. They just stop reading there. So USA Today, you'll see, will often have stories that just are short enough that they can end on the first page. Cut line is next to a photograph that describes it. There's a caption, and it's written by the copy editors or the reporters. And there have been mistakes with those. Sometimes the reporter loses control, and the copy editor puts in something different than what the reporter meant, or there's a mix-up. So that's where you really have to watch it. A teaser is a promo or a skybox, captures readers' attention to highlight the stories that are inside the issue. They weren't important enough to make it to the front page, but they're worth telling. Okay, that's all for this time, folks. See you next on Chapter 3.